You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we have news about the Durham probe. Now, this was the investigation that Republicans hinged their hopes on to try and prove that Trump's 2016 campaign's ties to Russia was a witch hunt and that there was no collusion. This is obviously something that Trump repeated ad nauseum. Glenn, it's been 4 years. Durham's work is now complete. What did he find?
So the New York Times, in a deep dive investigative reporting piece, pulled back the curtain on the Durham probe, and what we see behind that curtain couldn't be more ugly, and lots of it appears to be unethical. And, I will say it's a pretty complex and convoluted tale. So let's try to sort of break it down to its basics. And I want to start, Brian, with a concrete hypothetical to just kind of put in context what the Mueller probe was, and then how the Durham probe went about trying to undo the Mueller probe. So when I was a federal prosecutor, if somebody assigned me an investigation, I would put together a team. I would work that investigation as long and hard and aggressively and honorably and ethically as I could, and I would come to a conclusion. Often that conclusion was, I believe folks committed crime and I think they ought to be indicted. Can you imagine if I reached that conclusion and then somebody from the Trump administration came to me and said, Glenn, yeah, we don't like your conclusion. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to investigate you. This old prosecutor cannot describe the sort of institutional insanity and how dangerous and damaging and corrosive that is. But that is precisely what Bill Barr did, because Donald Trump did not like the fact that Bob Mueller was investigating the connections between the Trump campaign and Russia. And let's be clear, what Bob Mueller found was more than 140 communications and contacts between Trump campaign officials in the run-up to the 2016 election and Russian officials and Russian actors. Not only that, Bob Mueller found as many as 10 instances of Donald Trump committing the felony crime of obstruction of justice. Now, Trump couldn't be prosecuted for it at the time because he was a sitting president, and DOJ says you can't indict sitting criminal presidents, which is a silly policy to have, but so be it. Well, you know what? Bill Barr and Donald Trump didn't like any of that. So what they did was they said, we're going to open an investigation into the folks that investigated Trump Russia. And he appointed John Durham as special counsel. So ultimately what happened is John Durham sort of went around, including around the world, globe-trotting, looking for any evidence that U.S. law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies sort of started this probe into Trump Russia corruptly for political purposes. And guess what? It turned out they couldn't find any evidence that that was the case. Now, the New York Times reporting, which is just a wonderful deep dive piece, I recommend it to everybody, sort of trots out this parade of horribles, the things that happened behind the Durham curtain during this 4-year probe. And some of the things that they found, for example, is that a bunch of prosecutors resigned. They walked off the Durham investigation because of their sense that Durham was doing things that were unethical and they could not abide. They also disclosed or uncovered that Bill Barr and John Durham together tried to undermine the Department of Justice Inspector General investigation and report that concluded that the Trump-Russia probe was properly opened by law enforcement. So there is this whole parade of horribles, but there's one incident in particular that the New York Times article revealed that is really pretty earth-shattering. Bill Barr and John Durham went, like I say, globetrotting. They went to foreign countries and government officials in those countries trying to dig up dirt on U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agents and organizations, saying, hey, do you have any information that maybe U.S. agencies and organizations corruptly opened this Trump-Russia probe? First of all, it's pretty despicable that they're globetrotting doing this. But the Italian government in particular, one of the locations that they went to, Italian government officials said, no, we don't have anything that can help you undermine, your own investigation that y'all opened. But here's what we do have. We have evidence that Donald Trump is engaged in financial fraud, in financial crimes. Ironic, no, that Barr and Durham are going around the globe looking to undermine the Trump-Russia investigation, and they find just the opposite. They find evidence that Donald Trump committed financial crimes. Here's the kicker. At that point, Brian, what should have been done institutionally, if it's one thing I know the inside of the Department of Justice, what should have been done institutionally is that should have resulted in an investigation being opened into Donald Trump's financial crimes that were related to us by those Italian government officials. And that investigation should have been given to a completely separate team of prosecutors, because John Durham was out there trying to investigate something that Donald Trump was the victim of. You can't be in that position and now all of a sudden switch gears and be expected to investigate something that Donald Trump may have perpetrated by way of crimes. But you know what Bill Barr did? He said, hey, John, maybe he gave him a wink and a nod and said, why don't you just investigate this too? And, that represents a conflict of interest. It never should have happened. But the reporting from the New York Times is that John Durham started to investigate these financial crimes that were reported by these Italian government officials. And then you know what? The whole thing just seemed to die. It seemed to be buried. We got no more information about it. Does that surprise us? When Durham and Barr are looking to help Donald Trump, they get information that incriminates Donald Trump, and all of a sudden that information, poof, disappears. That is such a gross misuse of the Department of Justice, and it shows the continued weaponization of the Department of Justice by Bill Barr that I am hoping Merrick Garland sits up, takes note, and digs into all of this.
And of course, we have the weaponization of, the DOJ subcommittee that's coming into play. But I don't know that I would expect Jim Jordan to take on this issue, even though this is actually an issue that one would take on if they were actually interested in focusing on the weaponization of the DOJ. Let me ask you a question about that probe that was basically that we can infer was buried. What happens to that? Does that just go away? And also, like, just using common sense, is this the kind of thing that we would just say there's so many investigations open into Trump anyway? Is there a point at which it becomes kind of redundant to look into more investigations into him? Like, do even prosecutors say, we have so many open, let's just let this one fall by the wayside?
Yeah, we do feel like we're drowning, and I'm sure the Department of Justice often feels like it is drowning in a sea of Trump and Trump co-conspirator crimes. How do you get your arms around it all?
Yeah.
I have argued all along that it's too important not to get our arms around it all and hold high government officials accountable, not just for some, but all of their crimes. But you ask a great question. What happens with a criminal investigation that maybe dies on the vine or, goes to the Bill Barr Department of Justice to die? Can it be revived? The answer is absolutely yes. When I was chief of homicide at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, there were often times when we would investigate, murders or conspiracy cases, and we couldn't quite find enough evidence to indict anyone, and we would administratively close out that investigation. But you know what? A year later, 5 years later, we might get information that jump-started that old investigation. We would pull it back out of closed files, and we would begin investigating anew. Investigations, once closed, can always be reopened. There's no such thing as like double jeopardy when it comes to investigations, the way there is if there's a trial that results in a conviction or an acquittal. That can never be rebrought or retried because that would violate the double jeopardy clause. But investigations never fully die. They can always be revived. They can always be given a relook, and they often are. And I'm hoping that's what the Department of Justice is doing right now.
You and I have talked about the issue of, as soon as we see one indictment come down, we'll see a raft of others. It's just like the hard part is basically finding the first person willing to actually do that. And then after that, it's going to be easy and we're just going to see a wave of them. Do you think that once we see indictments handed down from Fulton County, for example, which could quite possibly be the first one, that then the government might look into this, since we know that we do have some evidence of some wrongdoing here, and they might revive this because, okay, now the dam's been broken, and so we can move ahead with a possible indictment.
Brian, I would like to think that the Department of Justice has the kind of backbone, has the kind of bravery and the kind of determination to move forward with indictments against a former president and his criminal associates.
I'm sensing you're not. I'm sensing it's nothing. I'm sensing you're not too optimistic about this actually happening. Then
I'm winding it up. You're right. Here it comes.
Yeah.
I would like to think that's the case, and that they don't need the safety net of a district attorney in Georgia like Fani Willis, who has just been sawing the justice wood in front of her in the most impressive fashion. That they don't really need that to get the nerve up to indict a former president. The reality, Brian, is I have a feeling the Georgia indictments will drop, and they are imminent. That's the word that Fani Willis used in court recently. And I do think that will embolden and encourage the Department of Justice to say, okay, now maybe we can accelerate our pace and move in the directions of indictments a little bit more quickly. And you know what? I hope they do that, not to give some atmospheric support to Fani Willis and her team if they are the first to indict Trump and company. But frankly, I think prosecutors who are investigating Donald Trump are going to need all the support they can find, both legally and atmospherically. And that's why I think once one indictment drops and the others begin to drop, that's when you're going to see Donald Trump fold like a house of cards. And I think he's going to be desperate to strike whatever kind of deals he can strike to minimize his exposure ultimately to prison.
And by the way, for anybody watching who wants to hear more about the Fani Willis decision to imminently indict or not, that link is right here on the screen. So definitely check out that video. Moving over to Bill Barr and his involvement in all of this, how does this impact him and his reputation? Because this guy's going on a rehab tour right now, and yet this is the bullshit that he was pulling while he was Attorney General.
Yeah, bullshit is a legal term that I often use when I'm referring to Bill Barr. Yeah. And really, the marquee evidence of Bill Barr's bullshit is when the federal judge in Washington, D.C., Judge Reggie Walton, who was appointed by Republican president after Republican president after Republican president, he's been on the bench since 1991. He concluded and ruled that Bill Barr lied about the Mueller report, mischaracterized the Mueller report, spun the Mueller report. These are quotes from Judge Walton's ruling, and that Bill Barr lacks candor. That's a quote. Bill Barr has engaged in so much institution busting misconduct that I'm hoping some of that will come home to roost. Am I wildly optimistic that Merrick Garland is going to aggressively sort of grab onto the crimes of a prior attorney general and hold him to account? I wish I could say I'm wildly optimistic about that, but frankly, I'm not.
And so now the irony here is that, all of these right-wing media personalities have spent years basically propping up the Durham probe as their salvation, as proof that it was all a witch hunt, that there was no collusion. This is going to prove that everything they said was complete bullshit, and yet there won't ever be any reckoning here, because the way the right-wing media ecosystem works is that they'll just use this stuff as while it's convenient, and then as soon as their information is disproven, they'll just move on, and there's never any, like I said, there's never any point at which they kind of take accountability for the lies that they've spread over the last few years. They just use it while it's convenient for them, and then they move on to the next thing. And so this will kind of die on the vine, but it's already served its purpose, because the point here, in my opinion, was never to actually get to the bottom of any facts, because we know what the facts were. We know that within the Mueller investigation, that there were even a number of Trump officials who pled guilty to what they were accused of. So I guess at the end of the day, this really is just one more extension of Republicans, their weapons, which is just they're leveraging the tools of government to help themselves politically.
Yeah, let's never forget that the Trump administration set the record for the most convicted felons ever in a presidential administration. Boy, they must be very proud.
What happens now with this investigation? Do we just assume that it's just kind of closed and, like I said, they've gotten what they needed to take out of it and then that's it?
I think it does get shut down now because John Durham also handed in his letter of resignation from the Department of Justice. He will resign and leave his office in February. I think that spells the end of the Durham probe. There is a responsibility that he has as special counsel to author a report and provide it to the Attorney General. And let's remember, after 4 years and countless, tax dollars spent on what is actually a witch hunt, the Durham probe, John Durham brought 2 prosecutions, and both of those prosecutions were abject failures, prompt not guilty verdicts. Durham went down in flames in both of those cases. And in fact, in connection with one of those cases, a prosecutor who was a longtime colleague of mine, his name is Anthony Scarpelli, he walked off the case. He quit in protest because he knew what Barr was doing was unethical. He said, I will not associate myself with this prosecution. Scarpelli left, and indeed he was right because that prosecution went down in flames.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining all of this stuff. I know to some people, myself included, that this is like way down deep in the rabbit hole, but I think that's the point. I mean, this stuff is supposed to be convoluted enough that Republicans can twist it into whatever ways they need to so that it can help them politically, and still be vague enough that, nebulous enough that no one will be able to push back on any of this stuff. And I think that's the way they like it. So thanks for explaining this stuff. And for any of those watching out there right now, if you want to keep up with legal news, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.